Okay, welcome back. We're going to go ahead and wrap up this scene and create ourselves a nice final render in this video. So let's continue here and finish this little mini project here off. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take Final Gathering, which is another indirect illumination feature of Mental Ray, to clean up basically the initial lighting created by the photon mapping and the importans, which are new to exercise 7. So let's go ahead and let's do that. Just going to go ahead and open up the renderer options here. And you can see I have my global illumination turned on and my photons here are, my photon map is set to frozen, which means that the rebuild option is turned off. So XSI or Mental Ray is going to continue to recycle and reuse this photon map right here. That's exactly what I want. What I can do now is go to Final Gathering and enable Final Gathering. Here's my default settings. It's set to multi-frame with 100 rays and 15 points will be interpolated, and max radius is set to 0. Okay. What I'm going to do is switch from multi-frame, and I'm just going to go to automatic to get myself a nice quick solution here. Now the number of rays is set to 100 by default, which is not going to be good enough. Okay. Now normally what I would do is I would go either to 256 or even 512. In this case, since I'm just doing a rendered still and not an animation or anything like that, I'm going to be able to get away with as little as just 128 rays here, and I'll interpolate 15 points, and the rest I'm going to leave alone. I don't want to add any extra diffuse settings simply because most of my diffuse bounces are being created by the importans and photons that I created with global illumination. So adding diffuse bounces really isn't going to add to the final image quality, but it's going to increase my render time, possibly double my render time, and that wouldn't be very good. So I'm going to leave the diffuse setting to the default, which is 0. Now down here I have the ability to create a Final Gather map. Right now what I'm going to do is I'm probably just going to come in here and rename my Final Gather map to ArchViz.fg map. I'm going to set it to overwrite existing file because I don't have a Final Gather map set up. This would be the first time that I render a Final Gather map with this specific scene here. So I'm going to leave it on overwrite, and everything else looks good. The only other option that I want to change up here is this option here, the fast lookup option, which says to collect the irradiance from photon map. This is going to allow the Final Gathering to render out a bit faster and give it a render boost. And since I'm using a small photon map, and if I go ahead and open up my browser here, hitting 5 on the keyboard to do that, go to my render pictures folder, which is the default location where XSI will store your Final Gather maps and your photon maps. You can see here's my ArchViz photon map. It's only 2.5 megabytes big, so it's a very small photon map. And the smaller the photon map is, the faster Final Gather can collect irradiance information from it using the fast lookup option. So I'll turn that on, and I'm pretty much set to go. Now let me go ahead and close that. The next thing I need to do is increase the number of samples on my portal lights that are at the windows. This is very, very important. Right now, even if I render at the highest quality settings and increase my anti-aliasing and so forth, I'm still going to get a lot of artifacting and some really nasty looking shadows there coming from the portal lights that are set at the windows. So let's open up the portal lights here. Let's go to an Explorer. Grab ourselves all the small window lights here and open up a shared PPG and go to the area tab. You can see the number of samples is set to the default, which is 3 and 3. Okay, that is no good. That's good for doing preview renders, but not good for doing a final render, especially if you scale up the size of the area light. In this case we did. The area light by default was set to 1 and 1 for the X and Y directions. In this case we increased it to 6 and 6 to make them bigger and make the lighting look better that's coming in through the windows. But by increasing the scale in the X and Y of these square area lights, we essentially are forced to have to use more of these shadow samples to get a better looking shadow. So it's just something you can't get away of, and you're just going to have to deal with. So the best thing to do here is increase the samples to the most that you can without increasing your render time too much and creating some nice quality shadows. So I'm going to go with 6 and 6, So I'm going to double my samples. And if I use a higher number of samples, the shadows will look better, but the render time is going to continue to increase and increase by very large amounts. So you want to be careful about that. In this case, I'm going to go with 6 and 6 because it's going to give me a good balance of quality and render speed. Okay, so I'll close that. Next thing I'm going to do is grab the large window lights here and open up their PPG. Let me just go ahead and collapse that real quick. I want to show you something. I'm going to move my camera around here. Get back to these rectangular large window area lights. You can see that these are set up like these long rectangles. They're very, very wide. And that's actually going to make a big difference in the way that our shadows look. Now if I come over here to the shared PPG that I just opened for these large window lights, you can see of course that my samples are set to 3 and 3. Now my scaling right now is set in the X or the width to 12 and the height is set to 5 or the Y. Okay, that's very important to make a note of. Why is that important? Because the wider areas are going to need more samples. So in other words, the U direction here pertains to the X and the V over here pertains to the Y over here. So the larger the scale, like I said before with the smaller window lights, the more samples you're going to need. Okay, so if my scale over here in the Y is set to 5, I'm probably going to need something like 6 over here for the V. But I don't want to use 6 for the U because the U, which pertains to the X over here, is much larger than 5 or even 6. It's set to 12, so I'm going to need a lot more. So I'm going to go ahead and increase this to say something like 10. And that might look good or it might not. I may need to go higher than that. If I do, I'll have to re-render again. But I'm going to go ahead and take my chances with a value of 10. Again, I'm not sure how good that's going to look, but I'm going to go ahead and go with 10 because I don't want to go with something like 12 or even higher than that because my render times are just going to go insane. I'm going to be taking some very, very long coffee breaks. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at 10 and 6. Again, more samples for areas that are larger. So the X is larger, so we use more samples. The Y is smaller, so we use less samples. It's pretty simple to understand. Okay, so let me close that. Let me go back to my first camera viewpoint, which is this area here that we were going to render before. And let me go back to my render options. Okay, so again, my final gathering settings are set like this. Using more final gather rays will look a lot better, but I don't want to go overboard. I don't want to go too crazy with it. So for a still render, using just 128 rays might actually look pretty good. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and take my chances with that. If not, I could always render again and take another coffee break and increase the number of final gather rays. Again, I want to make sure that my photon map is frozen, so I want to make sure the rebuild option is off. And I'm using the correct photon map, which in this case is ArchViz.phmap, or short for photon map. And my portons are on, all that good stuff is on, my GI is set correctly, my final gathering, again, this is about the third or fourth time that I check it, it looks pretty good. And under my rendering settings, I want to increase my anti-aliasing. So I'm going to go to about 0 and 2. Normally, I would go to about 1 and 3 or as low as 1 and 2. In this case, I'm going to go with 0 and 2. You can go ahead and increase your anti-aliasing settings. I'm not going to simply because I want to render this out fairly quickly, even though this render is going to take a while to render. And I'm going to go ahead and decrease my sampling contrast. The default is set to 0.2 for the RGB and the alpha channel. I don't want that though. I want the contrast to be even lower. So I'll go with 0.05 in all of my channels here. Okay. And the lower you go with this contrast, the longer your render is going to take, but you're going to have a higher quality render simply because more anti-aliasing will be performed. So that's one thing to make note of. So I'll go with 0.05, which is going to give me a nice production render. And going from minimum of 0 and 2 is probably going to look pretty good. Okay. Now I'll close that. The next thing I'm going to do is come over here to my pass options. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my format here, the size of the actual render. Right now we were using the preview size, which I had set up to 400 pixels. So I'm going to go ahead and double it to 800. I'm not going to go for a super high-res HD render because I'm just basically demonstrating things to you here. So if you want on your own time, you can go ahead and create a 2000 pixel render or higher or lower, whatever you want. I'm just going to go with 800 because it's going to work out. Because I have my lock aspect ratio turned on, whenever I change my width, you'll see that my height automatically changes accordingly. So I'll go with 800, close that, looks pretty good. And I'll go ahead and do a preview render to basically do my nice final full render. Okay, there it goes, much larger than before. It's pre-processing. It's going to start doing everything. This render is going to take a good amount of time. So I'm just going to pause the video here and skip on ahead and show you the final result when that finishes rendering. In the meantime, feel free to take a coffee break or go out for lunch. So I'll see you later when this is finished. Okay, so there's our final render. And you can see that we could use a little bit more anti-aliasing, so let me go ahead and close this. What I would do is just come back to the renderer options and increase the anti-aliasing to a minimum of 1 and maybe a maximum of 3. That's going to take longer to render, but you will get a nicer quality render and get some of that detail to come out a little bit better. Okay, so that's going to do it for this specific scene here, this topic over mental ray. That's going to end it for this section here, this chapter. We'll continue on with more features in mental ray in the next set of videos.